Welcome to another episode of On the Issues with Alon and Ben-Meir. Today's guest is Jane Olson, a noted humanitarian who has worked many decades as a volunteer promoting international peace and justice and humanitarian work. She has chaired the International Board of Trustees of Human Rights Watch from 2004 to 2010 and chaired the board of Survivor Corps for 12 years since its founding as Landmine Survivors Network. In this episode, Alon and Jane discuss the current rise in human rights abuses globally, what roles international organizations have played in combating human rights abuses, and the importance of educating people about their basic universal human rights, including starting in schools.
I am so delighted today to have my guest, an incredible individual, Jane Olson, who has devoted much of her life to one of the most painful, critical issues of our time, and that is human rights abuses. In just about nowadays, almost every corner we turn to, we see this kind of phenomenon, if anything, is on the rise. And let me just say a few words about Jane Olson herself. Jane Olson is a very long-time humanitarian leader who embarked on a lifelong crusade for peace, justice, and humanitarian actions. She's a former chair of the Human Rights Watch International Board, that is between 2004 and 2010, and has been active with the organization since 1988. She also served as the chair of the Landmine Survivors Network for 12 years. Her work contributed to the 1997 Nobel Peace Prize awarded to groups behind the International Landmine Ban Treaty. She's a member of the American Academy of the Arts and Sciences. She has served on a major policy and humanitarian boards. Her honors include the Human Rights Watch, Allison Ford Award, the Eleanor Roosevelt Award, and the California's Women Making History Award. What a pleasure, honestly, to have you today on this particular podcast. So I want to begin, if I may call you Jane.
Yes, please.
I want to begin, given your incredible journey as a crusader, I'd say, for peace, justice, and humanitarian causes. Can you tell our viewers what motivated you to devote your life, your time, your energy to this critically important work in connection with human rights?
Well, I think like every journey, it begins with one first step into this world. And it goes back so far, I can't tell you what the first step was, but I remember being a little girl and standing up to a much older, bigger boy who was bullying a child on the playground. And that was the first time I experienced genuine fear, but realized that it was coupled to a motivation of compassion. And it was a realization of a pre-teenager. And I think many of my friends around me were incredulous and kept telling me they were so proud of me. And at that point, I think I just took on this identity of somebody who's going to stand up for people who are being hurt. But I began working on humanitarian issues as a young mother. I was invited to go on a journey to Nicaragua and El Salvador during the Contra Wars. And it was something that my church, I go to a very progressive Episcopal church in Pasadena, All Saints Episcopal Church, and it works in ecumenical service with the Islamic Center in Los Angeles and also some very progressive synagogues in West Los Angeles. And a group of ecumenical leaders decided to send a delegation to Nicaragua and El Salvador to find out what was going on there and why innocent people were being murdered and abused in every kind of way. And that was my first real international journey involving a war. And I was so taken with that experience and decided that I wanted to devote my life to humanitarian work on behalf of protecting human rights. And I first needed to raise my children. So I did what I could in terms of speaking and writing and witnessing, but I didn't do another trip for a few years. And then I went to Cuba. And then when the war broke out in the former Yugoslavia, I went there. By that time, I had been invited to join the board of Human Rights Watch, which I later chaired. And I also got involved with the International Rescue Committee. When the war broke out in the former Yugoslavia, it really was a war against the Muslim population. It was a land grab, but basically it was a Orthodox Christian Serb population, really annihilating a Bosnian Muslim population that controlled the province of Bosnia. When the Soviet Union broke up, there were many wars that broke up, and largely because these populations were put together in borders that made no sense in terms of ethnicity and religious persuasion. But this war in the former Yugoslavia really captured my full attention because it was a religious war. And the Bosnian Muslims, and especially women, were being horrendously abused.
Yeah.
And that was my first experience of going in as a woman to meet with other women who were largely the victims of tremendous physical abuse, and whose families were killed, homes were burned, and so on. We found that they wouldn't talk to the men. The relief workers at the International Rescue Committee were primarily men who went in and, set up food and shelter and housing, water, and so on, protection for victims of war. But this population of Muslim women, culturally, wouldn't speak to the men and wouldn't share their experiences or their needs.
Right.
And so we started a new organization called the Women's Refugee Commission under the auspices of the IRC. And I chaired that for many, many years. As we've seen in so many wars, women are the most vulnerable. Women and children are so often victimized. And that's been quite a focus of my work.
Yeah. As you have been, and I have been very deeply involved, and as I'm looking around, I'm witnessing, a clear rise in human rights abuses just about wherever we turn nowadays. And I have given it a great deal of thought. I mean, from your perspective, what do you attribute this horrific rise in just about everywhere, specifically, targeting, well, obviously women and children are suffering the most. And it's a phenomenon not just in conflict zone, but it's in countries and even in Western powers and in other places. What do you attribute this rise, and why is it that has been intensified in recent years?
Well, the short answer to that is leadership. In the former Yugoslavia, Milosevic was such a bully and tyrant, and he issued violent hate speech. I think in this country, we are moving in the wrong direction. At this stage in the evolution of humanity, we should be understanding that we're all one. We should really understand the oneness of all humanity around the world, especially given the global climate change issues that we all share. Instead, we're more tribal. We look for differences in others, whether it's religion, color of skin, economic status, whatever. It seems to me that we've become more divisive, and a lot of that is because of leadership.
Let me revert back just to some people are saying, I believe that, essentially human remains savages, and all our cultural development, scientific development hardly touch the surface of our humanity. And that is deep inside, we remain violent and savage. Do you subscribe to that notion? Because when you speak about leadership, yes, obviously many leaders can make a huge difference. We will talk a little bit about, I hate to even to mention his name, Trump, later, but leadership, needless to say, matter. But what does it take to in fact change the dynamics of what's happening today? We know, I mean, there's a rise of authoritarian regimes in many different places, and so leaders do matter. But what it is that can be done in order to effect a real change? Take any leader, this kind of steps they can take in order to effect this kind of change, in order to mitigate this horrific and continuing human rights violation.
Well, that's not easy to answer, but I think fundamentally we need to redefine strength. What does strength mean? We have been defining strength by who has the most weapons, who has the largest economy, who has the most territory. Really, strength should be measured in our capacity for empathy and compassion. All of the religious leaders of every one of our major faith communities has stressed compassion and understanding and unity and love. At the core of it all is love. And yet wars are fought in the name of religion that go completely against that fundamental theocracy. So I think we have to redefine what is strength. Who do we see as strong?
But then there's the expression of interest, economic interest, political interest, and sometimes to serve that kind of interest, leaders do compromise when it comes to human rights issues, and we see this all over. So how can you change that? How can you change that? That is, as long as people have interest, and if that is, look what's happening, say in Turkey. It's happening in various areas where there's conflict. Leaders have specific interests, and then compromise on these compromises, including human rights, on human rights. So how do you reconcile between the ongoing, and that is something is not going to cease, that is political, economic, all kind of interests. How do you reconcile that when these leaders see human rights abuses as the means by which they can in fact advance their interest?
Well, we have set up the international institutions, the United Nations primarily, and also documents and rules by which practically every nation in this world has signed and agreed to abide by, the most important of which is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was advanced primarily through the dogmatic leadership of Eleanor Roosevelt. After World War II, we said never again, but we realized that we need to have rules and means to enforce them, that governments must sign, adopt, and then obey. And when they refuse to obey them, there have to be consequences. And I think that the smaller countries have faced consequences of violations, but the larger ones have not. And there's, it's a terrible pity, but our own country is violating some of the fundamental principles of the Universal Declaration. I can't answer how to put more teeth in it, but we have the tools that we need. They just need to be enforced.
Yeah, but that is exactly the question. You have the United Nations Human Rights Declaration. Many countries signed this declaration. They're supposed to abide by it, but they are violating. but then there are no enforceable mechanism, specifically today by the United Nations, given the conditions of the United Nations Security Council. So there is really no enforcing mechanism to compel these countries that are committing gross human rights violation to change course, to change direction. So how are you going to effect the change when there is no mechanism of enforcement?
Well, the reason I've been so active in Human Rights Watch and such a supporter of the work of Human Rights Watch is our researchers, who are country and regional experts, go into war zones and places where extreme violence or whatever violation of the Universal Declaration is taking place. They go in and investigate. They go into the hard, dark places. They talk to the victims. They take detailed notes of exactly what's happening and what's being done and by whom, so that we have all the facts. And then the mechanism that we have used is to publicize the egregious abuses being committed in these places where peace and justice has broken down, and then to blame and shame the governments and to try to shame them into compliance. That has been a very effective tool. I think it takes time, but I think it's really important to collect the specific details and know who the victims are, who the perpetrators are, and exactly what's happened. And there are hearings. The Human Rights Council is working hard. We do have courts and prisons to which some of the worst abusers have gone, and it's a long process. It takes time, but it has been effective. And we have war criminals in prison. And I think the importance is we have leaders now who are vying against each other to see who can be the cruelest, instead of who could be the champion of universal protection.
I certainly agree that organization that you've led have made a considerable difference in dealing with this painful issue. And you're saying, publicize, shame various government in order to effect the change. Can you, I'm not challenging you, I just want our viewers to see. Can you name 2 or 3 places where shaming the government, criticizing government, talking about their abuses have in fact made a difference in their behavior in connection with correcting their course of human rights practices?
Well, I think it's certainly I spent quite a lot of time in the war of ethnic cleansing in the former Yugoslavia. I think in that case, it was a long process, but Milosevic and Karadzic and some of the others were tried and convicted, and that war was stopped. I think then it's a long process to try to compensate people who've lost land and lost so much more. But the major leaders were imprisoned at The Hague, and I think we have to trust the process, even though it's not as immediate as we'd like it to be.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question. I mean, these do things to help, but given the enormous global violation of human rights, are we making a dent in that? I mean, are we making any real difference, discernible one? Do you see? I mean, you have devoted entire life to that, and I think it's the most admirable that can be said, that can anyone say about it. But do you see where do we go from here? That is, with all of these efforts, with all of these campaigns that are being done, we still watching that human rights abuses are on the rise rather than being diminished. what is going to take beyond advocacy, beyond the preaching of what's right and what's wrong? You mentioned earlier religion, for example. Religious teaching will call for adhering to human rights, to respect other people's right in every which other way you want to treat yourself, you want to treat others. But on the other hand, take religion, for example, let's say in Afghanistan, religion is used precisely to suppress women, to deny them their right. So what tools can be used other than, you mentioned leadership, and I think it's a critically important, but what other tools, viable tools, can be put in place in order to see if the effect further changes? At least to arrest the continuing rise of a human rights abuses.
Well, war begets war. And when you say what other tools, how do you put down violence? I don't believe you put it down with more violence. I think it's just the long process of caring for the victims, publicizing what's been done. One of the things that I have done is the United Nations has put out small booklets of the Universal Declarations of Human Rights. And it's just a small, like 3x5 little booklet. And I got lots of booklets printed into the languages of the countries where I was going, and I always handed those out in refugee camps and other places that I went to communicate with people that their government has signed on to protect and comply with these universal laws. Many people don't understand that they have basic human rights and don't understand when they're being victimized that their government is violating international laws and that they have a right to protest that and stand up for it. So I think information is one very important tool. I know I'm not answering your question, but it's astonishing how many people have no idea that that they have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and all the other tenets of the Universal Declaration. So knowledge is one important tool. And I think when people are armed with facts, they can, I hope, organize among themselves and find strong leaders to stand up to the perpetrators. There's not really an easy answer to the hard question that you're asking, but we need to keep asking it.
Yeah, I want to ask you, let's take education in schools, in high schools, even in elementary schools. To my knowledge, there are no specific courses teaching kids, young kids, about human rights issues. Don't you think, for example, I mean, to start mitigating some of these horrific violations, to start at that elementary level, to begin to enlighten, starting with kids, begin to understand what the human right is all about? Are we doing enough of that in our education system, not just in the United States, anywhere else for that matter? Do you see there is enough of that? Would that be something that we ought to, I know, advance, preach for, ask for, demand?
Yes, I think so. I have spoken at a lot of schools, especially since I published my book. I've gone into a lot of schools, and I always talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and how it was championed and promoted by a First Lady of the United States. And I think, even in preschools, you need to teach children that they can't bully and hurt and steal and abuse other children. Teachers need to be empowered to protect children and to tell them, you have no right to do that, and to tell other young children to come and report cases in which they've been hurt. I think bullies, the biggest tool of a bully is fear. They instill fear, and fear causes silence. And so I think you're absolutely right. Children need to understand that they have a right to be protected and to speak out against abuse.
Now, I would think that studies like this should be part of the curriculum in school, but I don't see that actually happening unless you go to specialized courses to study human rights issues. Again, I mean, this is something that should be talked about a great deal more, should be advocated for, that schools should, in fact, include in their curriculum courses that deal with the human rights issues. Don't you think, I mean, do you think that, first of all, there isn't enough of that? You agree that there isn't enough of that, if any? This is something that ought to be advocated for, pushed for.
At every level of education, yes.
That's that. Now, in terms of various human rights organizations like yours, of course, other than advocacy, they also react to horrific human rights abuses. What other forums, for example, public debates, conferences? I have not seen, for example, conferences actually devoted to talk about human rights issues. Debates that taking place. Why is it not missing? When you say, when you talk about leadership, that is a leader, obviously, other than preaching himself or herself the gospel of what needs to be done, they also ought to be promoting these ideas in schools and in public forums, in the media and elsewhere. To what extent, to your knowledge, public forums are used in order to advance, to make the people aware of the human rights abuses, more aware, obviously?
Well, there are a number of not-for-profit, non-governmental organizations focused on these issues. And of course, in many religious centers, this is something that they have special programs and forums for. But it's not enough. But one of the reasons that, as you know, I've worked not only as a Human Rights Watch advocate, but for very many years as a humanitarian also, and went into many countries that had wars of extreme poverty and abuse, or poverty and disease, because poverty and disease are also violations of people's basic human rights. No one should be going hungry. There should not be rampant starvation anywhere in this world today. Those are all human rights abuses. But at the same time as you're advocating for protection, you also need to do some healing. And I went in with a lot with the International Rescue Committee, which is one of the largest US-based organizations that goes in where people need food and shelter and water and protection. And as I mentioned, the Women's Refugee Commission. And I also helped to start an organization called Landmine Survivors that went into many countries where there were landmines, the most insidious anti-personnel weapon of all. And we helped work with people that had lost limbs and other horrendous injuries because of landmines. I think that if I hadn't been working both sides of this, I would have probably become too depressed. But it's important for me to have seen, to help people recover and to have seen the strength of human resilience. You give people a little help, and they have, tremendous interpersonal reserves and resilience. But then I also always told people about the Universal Declaration and their basic human rights, which is the ignorance was astonishing to me that people had no idea about what the United Nations had done and was doing, and other international organizations. But along the way, I saw so many other nonprofit organizations who, especially from the US, but also from Europe and um, other countries um, all around the world. And we work with each other. You know, the International Rescue Committee will talk to its counterpart um, and say, we'll take this country, you do this, we'll do shelter, you do food. You know, they work together. So I think at the top, the communication and networking of the humanitarian organizations is really quite effective. Again, it deals with the consequences, not with the prevention. But I think it's important to be doing both at the same time.
I want to ask you, and I'm switching a bit. Do you see any correlation between the rise of the right of center movement around the globe, extremism, right extremism, and the rise of human rights abuses? Do you see any correlations between the two?
I absolutely do. I think the Christian nationalism, which is certainly on the rise in this country, has had horrendous acts of violence committed in its name. Again, because it's divisive, it's tribal, it's pitting people against each other. And I'm a Christian myself, and never would Jesus Christ have advocated for any of the kinds of um, power struggles that we see going on, um, and the belittling and diminishing of others who are not on that team. I think Christian nationalism is anti-religious, and I'd say that to anybody.
You mentioned the rise of religious nationalism here in the United States. Let's look at the Trump base, the evangelical, religious, presumably that they adhere to morals, conduct, moral behavior. And they are now still dead supportive of Trump. And look what Trump has done in terms of the abuses of human rights. Just take, for example, ending foreign aid and the repercussions of foreign aid that has resulted in the death of tens of thousands of people in various countries in Africa,
Right.
starvation. I mean, I have a son who does work in Morocco, and has a foundation that actually deal with poverty, human rights issues, and all of that. And he said to me that the fact that they cut 4.5 million from USA has caused tremendous suffering in so many different villages that we used to be used to supporting. And yet, with all these shortcomings, his cruelty, is still getting the kind of support, solid support from the evangelical community, presumably religious people who are supposed to have, so to speak, a higher morals. How do you explain that?
I was hoping we'd get to this issue, Alon. It's a very tricky one. It's very sensitive, and many people are afraid to call it what it is. But it is really an extraordinary abuse of power. I happened to be with the woman who was the head of CARE, which is one of the largest U.S. foreign aid organizations. And on the day that Trump announced he was cutting the whole department and cutting off all international aid, and the announcement included telling aid organizations based in the U.S. that they would be punished if they made any deliveries of relief supplies after this announcement. At the time, she had 12 major big deliveries en route being shipped to places like Yemen and South Sudan, where there's massive starvation. And there were a lot of perishables, food and medicines that were perishable. And she had to call her staff people who were taking these supplies, who were en route with these supplies, and tell them they had to dump everything, immediately dump everything. Because more than 40% of the budget came from U.S.
Right.
grants. You can't make up the money that the U.S. foreign aid provided to nonprofit organizations who actually did the work and delivery for them in many cases. You can't make up for the loss of that government funding. The private sector can't possibly provide that money in donations. So she had to have all of the supplies dumped in the face of mass starvation and death that could have been forestalled and eased considerably by those shipments. It's tragic. And I think about the basic tenet of my religion, Christianity, is Jesus saying he really worked for the poor. He said, "Let the meek, let the poor, let those who were in great need come unto me." It wasn't, I want to just meet the strong leaders and the people that have money and power. No, he worked on behalf of the poorest, the sick, the families of people who had died. It was all compassion and empathy and caring for those most in need. And so I think they've taken the word of Jesus Christ and turned it on its head.
Right.
And that can be said of other religious leaders who act against humanitarian needs. No religious leader, of certainly any founder of any of the major religions, would have taken the path of our current political leaders. I think it's just outrageous, and I can't imagine how people can call themselves faithful to the word when they support the causing of so much pain to those in need.
Yeah, I'm talking about Judeo-Christian values, and I'm thinking what's been happening, for example, in the Palestinian territories, what Israel has been doing. As we speak now, the horrific attacks on Palestinian by the settlers, the tragedy of the Gaza war, the deprivation, the starvation, the killing, the death, destruction. And I ask myself, okay, but where are these so-called Jewish values? So when you talk about Judeo-Christian Jewish values, seem to all be set aside when it comes to conquest, when it comes to interest. I'll go back to the point I tried to make earlier. So they talk, they walk the high ground, but they can, when it comes to practically, dealing with real issues, and these values just are not applicable. So what is, in terms of, I'd like to see, for example, the religious leaders, Christians, Muslims, Jews, to get together and talk about the plight of what's happening. And many of them is happening in the name of religion. Israelis do that in the name of religion, as if this must have been bequeathed to them. So the humanization of the Palestinian, it's a natural phenomenon. And you see the same thing in Islam, in Afghanistan and elsewhere. What do you see from your experience? Have you seen any sort of effort by religious leaders from all faiths to get together and say, no, we cannot preach the gospel of what's right and what's wrong, but in fact, we're doing very little, if anything, about it in terms of advancing what we believe in. Do you see any of that? Is there any way we can ignite that kind of discussion among religious leaders?
Yes, I do see. Here in Los Angeles, we have a structured unity and forum for the leader of the Islamic Center. Not every, but some progressive synagogues, and also progressive Christian churches. It started really back in the early days of race religions with Martin Luther King and the religious leaders who went to walk with him across in Selma and across the bridge and so on. If you remember, there were many religious leaders who were arm in arm with Martin Luther King later in the movement when it became really national. They've ended up staying together and forming an ecumenical organization here in Los Angeles that I've been a part of. And I think those leaders, of course, have passed, but some of the younger ones of us who were supporting them have kept that going. And I don't know about other cities, but I think it's been terribly important.
You know, it's when you mentioned when we started in terms of takes leadership, and I agree with you, it takes leadership. What are the things from your perspective that take any leader today, but take the European communities, and there are human rights abuses within the European community as well. But what are some of these leaders who believe in democracy, or freedom, and human rights are doing or should be doing as leaders of major democracies around the world? What they are supposed to be doing? Why aren't they doing enough about it?
Well, I know in New York I have worked with like Riverside Church in New York. It's a progressive Presbyterian church. It depends on the individual leaders, the imams, the rabbis, the priests and ministers, to reach out to each other and to be invited to speak at each other's pulpits. It's very important. We've had a really good ecumenical leadership here in Los Angeles, but of course that's among the more progressive liberal institutions that actually follow the faith, and it doesn't trickle down to the more conservative face. But it's always easier to teach people to hate. It's always easier to teach people that they're superior. To teach love and unity is the hard work, and that is the basic truth of humanity. It's a basic truth of all life, is we are all one, and that love is the operating energy of the universe. I believe that so strongly. It's a central message in the book I wrote, and I actually, in writing this book, I had, of course, had gone into so many different war zones and places of extreme poverty and disease all over the world. And I'm a photographer, I'm a journalist. And so I took extensive notes about people's stories and took a lot of photos. And so I told stories about individual people and what they had experienced, and then the background of what had caused it, some of the history and so on. It's so much easier to feel sorry for one person, to have compassion and empathy for one person. The numbers can be overwhelming. I mean, even the Holocaust, people cannot relate to just that massive a killing.
Right.
But they can relate, they can cry over the story of one child. And that's why I think storytelling is so important.
I just want to our viewers to hear, you travel to many areas for many conflict zones. Can you just impart with your viewers some of the most egregious things that you've witnessed in some of these travels in conflict zones where violence was raging, and obviously human rights abuses was more than common. Can you give us, our viewers, some sense of what you have witnessed?
Well, I'll tell you, this is the cover of my book, and this woman is in Azerbaijan. She's a grandmother, And I loved her story. When the Soviet Union broke up, you know, there were wars that broke out in the Caucasus and the Balkans, and I spent a lot of time. This particular war, the cover picture of this woman, was a war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and it was over a tiny little territory called Nagorno-Karabakh, and it was because the Soviet Union took that small territory from Armenia and gave it to the Azeris, gave it to Azerbaijan. And that's one of the ways they controlled these small countries. Well, Nagorno-Karabakh was like the culture of Armenian, the religion, and it was like the Bethlehem, I guess, of the Armenian culture and religion. And so they fought over that tiny little territory for so long. And similar situations going on in Yugoslavia. It was over artificial creation, drawing maps that put people, excluded people from their natural territories and gave them other. It's all about land and property and keeping people divided. One of the reasons that it was so troubling to me is all people looked alike to me.
Yes.
You know, it's much easier when you can see tribal difference, you know, blacks against whites and that sort of thing. It's much easier. But these people all look so much the same to me, and they were suffering in similar ways. It's always the women and children. But they were living in just devastating situations in caves, you know, in the 20th century. And it was just so puzzling to me how once they were given their freedom from the Soviet Union, or they took their freedom from the Soviet Union, then all of these disputes broke out that were just so extremely violent and devastating, and especially to women and children and families. I think I went over there many times, and I wrote so many stories about it because I saw them as being the same, and their stories were so much the same, and they were suffering in similar ways, and yet they hated each other.
Okay.
And that's kind of what I wanted to show, is to put a face on the victim. And it's not that their suffering isn't real and tragic, and they have reason, you know, to hate the other. But if they just could know the other, they would understand their suffering in the very same way. I think the wars like that are the kind that were the most upsetting to me.
We are obviously I mean, anyone with a feeling, sensitive, concern, as a people, we are directly or indirectly affected by these horrific human rights abuses. I would like you to suggest, as individuals in various communities, what individuals as a human being anywhere can do. We talk about the leaders, religious leaders, political leaders, but as an individual, what individual can do to contribute to alleviating this horrific phenomenon of human rights abuse in various places, various communities. What can an individual do in this regard?
Well, I think stand up to hate speech. You know, you were talking about what's going on in Israel with the Palestinians. That's absolutely been horrific, horrific. I mean, there's no end to the suffering and devastation that's happened to the Palestinians and you know, in southern Gaza. Horrendous. But you don't start hating Jews and attacking synagogues, because this is not done by the Jewish people. It's done by Netanyahu, a terrible, horrible, violent autocrat who has caused, our president is looking the other way. But I think anti-Semitism in the United States is not an answer to what's happening in Palestine. And that's, I think you have, again, we hope that we've turned on our allies. I don't know why any country would want to sign a treaty with us in the future if we can have an election like this past one and then throw away all of these treaties that took decades to formulate and that have kept the peace ever since World War II. But I hope that our friends in Canada and Mexico and our friends in Europe will say it's not the American people, it's the leadership in the White House.
Right.
Terrible authoritarian leader. We don't want to see acts of violence against Americans who go visit countries that used to be our allies. It's the very same difference, but I think people have to be taught to think that way. It's
But they don't see it necessarily this way. I'm told, the Europeans were looking at us when Trump was first elected. They said, well, that was an aberration. He was elected, and so this period is going to go, and the United States will resume its role of leadership. It's constructive foreign policy. It's a good relationship with its ally. But then when Trump was elected the second time, and talking to many political leaders, they tell me openly, this is one thing to be elected one time, that would have been an aberration. But being elected the second time, they no longer blame the leadership, but they are now start to blame the American people for having the short-sightedness to elect someone unhinged like a Trump. So here, his horrific leadership, his horrific abuses, now has been rubbed on the American people. Right. And what do you do about that? And that is what is happening now.
And maybe deservedly so.
Yeah.
If the numbers that were claimed in the election are right, it's I guess we deserve what we got. But let's go back to your earlier suggestion about education.
Right.
I really think that we have, when I went to school, I grew up in the Midwest. In 7th and 8th grade, we had 2 years of civics. We learned the Constitution. We memorized the Declaration of Independence. We learned about 3 branches of government and had to pass tests about civics. I don't think it's being taught anymore.
That's right.
And I think that a lot of we have a pretty ignorant electorate. And again, they're defining strength as the person who can yell the loudest and be the biggest bully and claim
right.
And make wild claims that are not based on fact. So, we really have to go back to teaching our children from at least 8th grade on about the basic tenets of democracy.
Yes.
And I really think that's been neglected.
What would you like to our viewers to hear the last word? What would you like to suggest to conclude this? I wish we had more time to speak so much more about this issue, but anything else you would like to impart with our viewers on this subject?
Well, of course, that's a big question, a big opportunity. I appreciate it. Yesterday, I received an honorary doctorate at Pomona College and gave a speech there. It's a very fine.
Congratulations.
Yeah, very, very fine college, and I was very proud to do that. And I told the students that one of the most important lessons I have learned is how valuable it is to listen to other people. So often when people are talking, we're busy thinking about how we want to answer or challenge them or argue with them or something. But if you just listen to people, what people are saying, you could learn so much. And then I ended by saying, listening is a kindness.
Exactly.
And that I hope that you will be kind to everyone all the time, because that is the path to peace.
There's no better, more eloquent message that you have impart with everyone who's listened to this. Jane, thank you so much for taking the time, and I hope we'll have an opportunity to talk more about this so very, very important issue. Thank you again.
Be happy to talk to you anytime. I appreciate this opportunity, and I'm so grateful for the work that you do. I mean, just the name of your organization, the Institute for Humanitarian Conflict Resolution. That's the basic of my goal for life.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So thank you for all that you do, and I hope we'll keep the contact open.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. I'm meeting you. It's really my pleasure. Thank you again, Jane. All the best.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode on the issues. You can find this podcast on my SoundCloud page, and stay tuned to my social media accounts for the latest analysis and announcements.